Robert Campbell writes of his expedition with Martin Delany to the Niger Valley. It is regarded as of still great importance in facilitating the production of those staples, particularly cotton, which now are supplied to the world chiefly by slave labor. The effect of this would be to lessen the profits of slavery, to render in time the slave a burden to his owner, and thus furnish an irresistible motive to emancipation. Africa possesses resources which, properly developed, must doubtless render her eventually a great, if not the greatest producer of all the products of slave labor. And how would all good men rejoice to see the blow which shall eventually prostrate the giant slavery struck by the black man's own arms. So the whole idea was to take this talent that had been building up the West, repatriate it back to Africa, and allow Africa to develop so it could get back to equal footing as a trading partner with the rest of the world. The Caribbean-born Liberian scholar Edward Blyden articulated a similar Pan-Africanist view in 1883. He says, "I say that it's gratifying to know that there are Negroes of this country who will go to do this great work cheerfully and brave the hardships and perils necessary to endure in its accomplishments. This will be among the redeemers of Africa." So there's this sentiment that the purpose of going to Africa is to redeem it, to redeem the race, to redeem the culture, to enrich the people of the continent and to make it grow. Blyden further elaborates the sentiment shared by later Pan-Africanists such as Garvey, Du Bois, and Nkrumah when he states, "There are Negroes enough in this country," and he means in the U.S., "to join in the return, descendants of Africa enough who are faithful to the instincts of the race and who realize their duty to their fatherland." Clearly, throughout the 19th century, the diaspora and the continent formulated a working Pan-Africanist agenda with persons of their own agents like Cuffey, Delany, Blyden, and the Alake of Abeokuta. But this embryonic Pan-Africanist agenda was thwarted by more concerted effort from Western colonialists, imperialists, and racialists. You have to understand that it was not for lack of effort, but that the growing need, and I think we heard earlier about the way in which King Leopold held the Congo, what is now the Congo, as his personal property. But there was a great tension between those in the African diaspora who wanted to go back to the continent, who wanted to help to grow the continent, and the colonialists who were coming down and saying, it's not going to happen. This is our property. We're going to run it the way that we want. And what did they do? Garvey, for example, was blocked by the British from ever going to Africa. As great as his influence was, he died in London without setting foot on African soil because they would not give him papers to travel to Africa. They feared him that much. Between the 1860s with Reconstruction in America and the 1890s with colonial rule in Africa, Africans at home and abroad lost more autonomy. The West busied itself with the social, political, and economic suppression of the African in his homeland, and the idea of reparating more Africans, especially those who espouse cultural and economic Pan-Africanism, was a direct threat to that effort. After the Berlin Conference of 1885, racial or traditional Pan-Africanism intensified the cultural and political desire to restore the continent's autonomy and dignity. This desire for African unification did not, in fact, obfuscate the cultural fusion and cultural confusion that resulted from clashes between European and African cultures as they were beginning to play out in the West. Moreover, the diaspora itself was neither politically nor economically secure. Mob violence and lynching of African American men, women, and children were rampant during the era of European colonization of Africa and continued well past the years of the Garvey movement in the Americas. That's why we have to look at these two histories side by side. Because on the one hand, Africa now is engaged in a very bitter and brutal physical war against enslavement and the encroachment of European powers that have determined in 1885 they're going to take over the resources of Africa. African Americans and people in the Caribbean as well were locked in a battle because slavery didn't end in Brazil till 1890, right? So in the Caribbean and the United States, people were also locked in a very violent struggle for their humanity and their survival. So what happens in that era is that the sheer terrorism associated with lynching required constant vigilance, as the NAACP poster indicated that 3,436 people were lynched between 1889, which is 4 years after the Berlin Conference, and 1922. While the African in the homeland and the diaspora quickly grasped their common plight, the intensity of violence that came with colonialism, imperialism, and racial domination in both hemispheres demanded immediate local attention. So everybody locked down on their struggles at the moment, and this interfered with the move towards greater solidarity. In addition, racially motivated immigration policies towards growing African English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish-speaking diaspora from the Caribbean and the Americas limited their access to the United States. So what's happening? In Africa, people are not being let out, and people of African descent are not being let in. So they stopped the slave trade, which is a good thing, but they're not letting people out anymore to continue with commerce, and they're not letting Pan-Africanists who were there earlier come in. In the Caribbean, the same thing is happening. People can't get out, and they can't get in. In the United States, the same thing is happening. People can't get out, and they can't get in. So a lot of the immigration now is controlled, and the flow of ideas is also controlled through that. And as the racial intensity grew in the 15 years between the economic collapse of 1929, the first Great Depression, and the formation of the United Nations Organization, global Africans responded to their cultural, economic, and political oppression organizationally through the NAACP, regionally through the West African Student Union, and globally through the Fifth Pan-African Congress. Between 1815 and 1958, global Africans presented diverse cultural and political challenges to external domination and racial oppression that evolved through both elite and mass organizations. And I think that the point was well made earlier when you spoke to the difference between the NAACP's agenda and other organizations like that and SNCC's agenda, which comes along later on as more mass movement. But throughout most of the history, there were these two class-oriented struggles that were going on for the same end. Garvey and Nkrumah are 20th century examples of this response. Professor Daniel Ofiong sums up their impact in 1975 by stating, Garveyism and Nkrumahism have established roots which affirm there's rarely any place in Africa today where the cry, Africa for Africans, is not heard. In the U.S., blacks are tenacious and vehement in their demand for equal rights and equality of opportunity. The important strides that Africa has taken in international arenas have boasted black pride and identity. Blacks are black and proud, and there is absolutely no reason to believe that black Africans and black Americans will once again accept the primitive and barbarous image once imposed upon them under slavery and colonialism. And I think when you hear for all you young people in here, when you hear people getting upset about some of the images on the video, it's because of that. It's not trying to restrict your right and freedom of expression, but it's because the people had to fight so long to regain our humanity, and it looks as though we're giving it away. And that's part of the problem.